There was a moment, just days after the latest round of strikes between the United States and Iran, when it looked as though the Middle East might be on the edge of another major regional war. Military aircraft were in the air. Missile defenses were activated across multiple countries. Governments issued emergency warnings. Yet within a remarkably short period, the conversation shifted from escalation to restraint. Reports began indicating that both Washington and Tehran were signaling they wanted to avoid a broader conflict even after demonstrating military capability. What happened? Did the United States achieve its objectives and choose not to escalate further? Or did Iran's military posture and regional influence convince Washington that the costs of continued confrontation were simply too high? Those two interpretations lead to very different conclusions about the balance of power in the Middle East. Officials on both sides publicly claimed success. American leaders argued that their operations significantly degraded Iran's military infrastructure. Iranian officials, meanwhile, insisted they had preserved their strategic capabilities and forced the United States to reconsider any wider campaign. Sources are now confirming that behind the public statements, intense diplomatic activity was taking place to prevent a larger regional conflict. And what you're about to hear changes everything about how this crisis unfolded. Because this story isn't simply about missiles, military bases, or political speeches. It's about deterrence, perception, and the difficult calculations that governments make when every decision carries the risk of regional war. Understanding those calculations may explain why events unfolded so differently from what many analysts expected. Before we dive deeper, make sure you've hit the notification bell so you don't miss updates on how this story develops. This situation is evolving fast. Here's what happened. In the days immediately following the ceasefire announcements in late June 2025, officials in Washington and Tehran presented dramatically different versions of the same events. President Donald Trump declared that U.S. military operations had delivered a decisive blow to Iran's nuclear infrastructure, while senior Iranian leaders insisted the country had absorbed the strikes without surrendering its strategic position. Those competing narratives quickly sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles across the Middle East. President Donald Trump, speaking from the White House, argued that the United States had demonstrated overwhelming military superiority while emphasizing that Washington did not seek a prolonged war. At nearly the same time, Iranian officials, including senior commanders within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and government spokespersons, announced that Iran's retaliatory missile launches had proven the country retained both the capability and the willingness to respond if attacked again. I'm quoting directly here. Each side portrayed itself as the victor. Reports are now confirming that, behind those public statements, regional governments were working urgently to prevent another round of escalation. Gulf states increased diplomatic contacts, international mediators intensified communications. Military commanders across the region remained on heightened alert, concerned that even a single miscalculation could trigger another exchange of strikes. Here's what makes this especially significant. Neither Washington nor Tehran behaved like governments preparing for total war. Instead, both appeared determined to demonstrate strength while avoiding actions that would make de-escalation politically impossible. That delicate balance, showing resolve without crossing the threshold into a wider conflict, became the defining feature of the crisis. Understanding that distinction is essential because the public rhetoric suggested one reality while the diplomatic and military signals pointed toward another. And that gap between perception and strategy is where this story becomes far more complex. If you're finding this as significant as I am, hit the like button. It helps this critical analysis reach more people who want to better understand the strategic dynamics behind these events. Now, what I'm about to show you changes everything you thought you knew about the U.S.-Iran confrontation. Because for more than 45 years, the formula was relatively simple. Washington applied economic pressure. Tehran responded through regional alliances and asymmetric capabilities. Both sides pushed hard, but usually stopped short of a full-scale conventional war. That's how the system worked. The latest confrontation challenged many of those long-held assumptions. For decades, the pattern repeated itself. The United States maintained military bases across the Gulf, projecting power through partnerships with countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Iran, meanwhile, invested heavily in missile technology, air defenses, and relationships with non-state armed groups across the region. Everyone assumed that direct military exchanges would remain limited because the risks of escalation were simply too high. That assumption shaped policy on both sides. American planners generally believed that superior conventional military capabilities would deter Iran from direct confrontation. Iranian strategists, on the other hand, emphasized deterrence through resilience, making any potential conflict costly enough that Washington would think twice before expanding it. Sources are now confirming that this balance of deterrence has become increasingly complex as missile technology, drones, and regional alliances have evolved over the past decade. Here's what nobody's talking about. The latest crisis wasn't significant merely because missiles were launched or military facilities were targeted. It was significant because both governments tested the boundaries of that long-standing deterrence model without allowing it to collapse entirely. Instead of producing an uncontrollable regional war, the confrontation revealed how both sides attempted to combine military action with political restraint. Here's where it gets complicated. On the surface, this appeared to be another familiar chapter in the decades-long US-Iran rivalry. Military strikes followed by retaliation, political speeches, and warnings of further action. That's the version most headlines focused on. One side claimed it had restored deterrence, the other insisted it had stood its ground. To many observers, it looked like another cycle of escalation that would eventually fade from the news. But here's what nobody's talking about. The real story wasn't simply the exchange of military force, it was the careful management of escalation. Sources are now confirming that multiple governments, including regional partners and international intermediaries, worked behind the scenes to maintain communication channels, even while public rhetoric remained confrontational. Officials were sending two very different messages at the same time, one for domestic audiences and another for foreign governments seeking to prevent a wider war. The latest information shows that military planners on both sides understood the enormous risks of miscalculation. A strike that appeared limited could easily have triggered a much broader regional conflict involving Gulf states, Israel, and U.S. forces stationed throughout the Middle East. Documents and public statements from defense officials suggest that avoiding that outcome became an immediate priority once the initial military exchanges had taken place. Why does that matter? Because it challenges the common assumption that every military exchange inevitably leads toward full-scale war. In reality, modern deterrence often involves carefully calibrated actions designed to demonstrate capability without crossing the threshold that would make diplomacy impossible. That doesn't make the situation safe, it makes it far more complicated. Strength today is measured not only by military power, but also by the ability to control escalation after force has already been used. And that's the first layer of this story. The public watched missiles and headlines. Behind the scenes, governments were racing against time to ensure those headlines didn't become the opening chapter of a much larger regional conflict. If you want to stay ahead of these developments and follow well-researched analysis of global security issues, subscribe to the channel. We break down these complex stories with context that often gets lost in the daily news cycle. But that's not even the real story. The deeper issue wasn't whether either side could launch missiles or conduct airstrikes. Military analysts have known for years that both the United States and Iran possess significant capabilities in different areas. The real story is how both governments carefully shaped the narrative after the fighting. Winning on the battlefield was only one objective. Winning the information war, convincing domestic audiences, allies, and rivals that they had achieved their goals became just as important. Here's how the pieces begin to connect. Within hours of the military exchanges, officials in Washington emphasized the effectiveness of U.S. precision strikes against key Iranian facilities. At the same time, Iranian state media highlighted missile launches and portrayed them as evidence that Tehran had successfully imposed costs on the United States and its regional partners. The timing wasn't accidental. The latest information shows both governments understood that public perception could influence future deterrence as much as military damage itself. Consider two important details. First, the crisis unfolded over a matter of days, not weeks, demonstrating how quickly regional tensions can escalate. Second, multiple regional governments immediately increased diplomatic engagement, recognizing that even one additional strike could have altered the trajectory of the conflict. Reports are coming in that communication channels remained active throughout the crisis, despite the intense public rhetoric coming from both capitals. That combination of military pressure and diplomatic restraint is what makes this episode different from many previous confrontations. Neither side appeared willing to accept the enormous political, economic, and human costs of a prolonged regional war. Instead, each sought to establish credibility while preserving an exit path from further escalation. The broader implication is significant. Modern conflicts are increasingly fought on multiple fronts at once, through military operations, strategic messaging, diplomacy, and international public opinion. Success is no longer measured solely by territory gained or targets destroyed, but also by whether a government can shape perceptions without triggering a conflict it cannot control. If you think more people need to understand the strategic dynamics behind stories like this, hit the like button and share this video. Thoughtful analysis helps separate verified developments from speculation. Now let's move beyond the headlines and look at the strategic mechanics that shape this crisis. Military planners often describe these confrontations using terms such as escalation management, proportional response, and deterrence restoration. Those phrases appear regularly in defense briefings and strategic assessments. Officials are now saying the objective is to impose costs on an adversary while preventing the conflict from expanding beyond political control. Let me translate that. In plain English, it means each government wants to demonstrate that attacking it carries consequences, but neither wants to trigger a war that could spiral into something neither side can predict or afford. That's industry speak for show strength without losing control. Here's why that matters. The United States possesses overwhelming advantages in conventional air power, intelligence, logistics, and global force projection. Iran, meanwhile, has spent decades building a different kind of deterrent. Ballistic missiles, drones, hardened military infrastructure, and partnerships with armed groups across the region. Rather than matching American military power directly, Tehran has invested in making any conflict increasingly costly for its opponents. Think about what that means in practice. Imagine two chess players. One has more powerful pieces. The other cannot match that strength. So instead, they build a position where every aggressive move comes with significant risk. The stronger player may still have the advantage, but every attack must be weighed against the possibility of unexpected consequences. That's the logic that increasingly defines U.S.-Iran military planning. Reports are coming in that this strategic calculation influenced decisions throughout the recent crisis. American officials sought to demonstrate military superiority without becoming trapped in a prolonged regional campaign. Iranian leaders attempted to signal that they retained credible retaliatory capabilities while avoiding actions that would almost certainly provoke a much larger response. That's not diplomacy replacing military strategy. It's military strategy supporting diplomacy. Understanding that distinction is essential because modern deterrence is no longer measured only by who possesses the larger arsenal. It's measured by whether each side can convince the other that the cost of further escalation outweighs any potential benefit. That balance is fragile, constantly evolving, and dependent on political judgment as much as military capability. What's your take on this approach? Does it represent effective deterrence, or does it simply postpone a larger confrontation? Drop your opinion in the comments. I read them all. And then this happened. The military exchanges between the United States and Iran did not remain a bilateral issue for long. Within hours, governments across the Middle East and beyond began issuing carefully worded statements. Some called for immediate restraint. Others reaffirmed their security commitments. What became clear was that the consequences of any further escalation would extend far beyond Washington and Tehran. The first responses came from America's regional partners. Countries including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman emphasized the need for de-escalation while maintaining close coordination with the United States. Several governments increased security around critical infrastructure and military installations, recognizing that energy facilities, shipping lanes, and regional airspace could quickly become targets if hostilities resumed. International organizations also weighed in. Officials at the United Nations renewed calls for diplomacy, urging all parties to avoid actions that could destabilize the region further. European governments echoed similar concerns, emphasizing that military confrontation would threaten not only regional security, but also global energy markets and international trade. Reports are coming in that diplomatic channels remained active around the clock as multiple governments attempted to prevent another cycle of retaliation. Israel, meanwhile, continued to monitor developments closely, stressing its commitment to national security while remaining alert to any shifts in Iran's regional posture. The latest information shows that intelligence sharing and military coordination among key allies remained at a heightened level throughout the crisis. Why does that matter? Because when countries with different political interests all prioritize preventing escalation, it signals that the risks extend well beyond the immediate conflict. This was no longer just a dispute between two long-standing adversaries. It had become a test of whether regional diplomacy could keep pace with rapidly unfolding military events. The response also highlighted a broader reality. In today's interconnected security environment, even a limited exchange between two nations can trigger diplomatic, military, and economic reactions across multiple continents. The international response is still evolving. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss future updates as more governments reveal their positions and new developments emerge. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. For years, officials on both sides insisted that their policies were designed to preserve stability and prevent a wider regional war. Washington repeatedly stated that its military presence in the Middle East existed to deter aggression and protect allies. Tehran, meanwhile, argued that its missile program and regional partnerships were purely defensive measures intended to discourage foreign intervention. Think about that for a moment. During the latest crisis, both governments claimed they were acting to prevent escalation. Yet while those statements were being delivered, missiles had already crossed international borders, military installations had been placed on maximum alert, commercial airlines rerouted flights, and global energy markets reacted to fears of a broader conflict. The rhetoric emphasized restraint, but the region was experiencing one of its most dangerous periods in years. Less than 24 hours after the most intense military exchanges, diplomats were reportedly working through multiple channels to reduce tensions. Less than a week later, both Washington and Tehran were highlighting the importance of avoiding another round of direct confrontation. The irony was difficult to ignore. Publicly, each government projected confidence and victory. Privately, both appeared focused on ensuring the confrontation did not spiral beyond their control. That's not necessarily hypocrisy. It reflects one of the central paradoxes of modern deterrence. Governments often demonstrate military strength while simultaneously searching for diplomatic exits. Force and negotiation can occur at the same time, even if they appear contradictory to outside observers. The contrast reveals something important. Military operations may dominate the headlines, but they rarely tell the entire story. Behind every public declaration lies a parallel effort to manage risk, reassure allies, and prevent unintended consequences. Understanding both tracks is essential to understanding the crisis itself. If this contradiction concerns you as much as it concerns me, hit the like button. It helps more people discover thoughtful, evidence-based analysis of major geopolitical events. Here's what this means practically. The recent confrontation wasn't only about military capabilities. It also exposed how deeply global security, energy markets, and international trade are connected. Even a limited exchange between the United States and Iran has consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Financial markets, shipping companies, insurers, and governments all begin recalculating risk the moment tensions rise in the Persian Gulf. Consider the economic dimension first. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, making it one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. Even the perception of instability can push energy prices higher, increase insurance costs for commercial vessels, and create uncertainty for countries heavily dependent on imported oil. Reports are coming in that energy traders closely monitored every official statement during the crisis, recognizing that markets often react before governments do. Strategically, the stakes are just as significant. For the United States, maintaining freedom of navigation and reassuring regional allies remain central objectives. For Iran, demonstrating that it can influence one of the world's most important energy corridors strengthens its deterrence strategy. Neither side necessarily benefits from disrupting global commerce, but both understand that the possibility of disruption carries strategic weight. Think about what that means in practice. A shipping company deciding whether to send a tanker through the Gulf isn't only evaluating fuel costs, it's calculating security risks, insurance premiums, and the possibility of sudden military escalation. Those additional costs eventually ripple through global supply chains, affecting everything from transportation expenses to consumer prices. That's how a regional military crisis can influence economies thousands of miles away. What this means strategically is that modern power extends well beyond missiles and military bases. Economic resilience, secure trade routes, diplomatic partnerships, and investor confidence have become critical elements of national security. Countries that can protect those assets gain long-term advantages, while prolonged instability imposes costs on everyone involved. This kind of strategic competition is unlikely to disappear. Even when the immediate crisis subsides, governments will continue reassessing military deployments, energy security, and regional alliances in light of what they've learned from this confrontation. This kind of strategic analysis takes hours of research. If you value this depth of coverage, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone interested in understanding how geopolitics shapes the global economy and international security. So where does this actually go? Because here's the thing, launching precision strikes is difficult. Building credible deterrence is even harder. Creating a stable regional security environment after a military confrontation, that's hard, really hard. The first challenge is political consistency. Military operations may last only a few days, but foreign policy decisions have consequences that stretch across years. Elections take place, governments change, and strategic priorities evolve. A policy that appears decisive today may be reconsidered tomorrow if domestic politics, economic pressures, or international events shift the calculations. Sources are now confirming that policymakers on all sides are weighing not only military outcomes, but also the long-term political costs of continued confrontation. The second challenge is regional complexity. The Middle East is not a conflict involving only two countries. It is a network of alliances, rivalries, economic interests, and security commitments. A decision made in Washington can affect Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi, Baghdad, and Tel Aviv within hours. Likewise, decisions made in Tehran can influence events far beyond Iran's borders. Coordinating these competing interests while preventing unintended escalation remains one of the greatest diplomatic challenges. Then there's the question of deterrence itself. Can both sides continue demonstrating strength without crossing the line into a broader conflict? History suggests that's an increasingly difficult balance to maintain. One intelligence error, one missile that misses its intended target, or one misinterpreted military movement could rapidly change the situation. That's why officials continue emphasizing communication channels even during periods of heightened tension. Will it be enough? No one can answer that with certainty. Reports indicate governments are actively trying to reduce the risk of miscalculation while maintaining their strategic positions. That is a delicate balancing act, one that requires military discipline, diplomatic engagement, and political restraint all at the same time. The reality is that avoiding war is often far more complicated than preparing for one. Success will depend not only on military capability, but also on whether leaders can resist the pressure to escalate when the next crisis inevitably emerges. What do you predict? Will this strategy of deterrence and restraint succeed, or is a larger confrontation only being delayed? Share your prediction in the comments and explain why you see the situation unfolding that way. Here's where this goes from here. The immediate exchange of strikes may have ended, but the strategic contest is far from over. The next several months will likely determine whether this crisis becomes another contained episode in the decades-long US-Iran rivalry or the foundation for an even more dangerous confrontation. Military planners, diplomats, and intelligence agencies will all be watching for signs that either side is changing its posture. Now, here's what I'm watching for. The first checkpoint is whether Washington adjusts its military presence in the Middle East. Any significant reinforcement of regional bases, additional naval deployments, or expanded air defense systems could indicate that U.S. officials expect renewed tensions rather than lasting stability. The second checkpoint is Iran's response in the months ahead. Will Tehran prioritize diplomatic engagement while maintaining its deterrence strategy, or will it accelerate missile development, military exercises, or cooperation with regional partners? Officials are now saying that Iran's next strategic moves will be closely monitored by governments throughout the region. The third checkpoint involves diplomacy itself. Future meetings between regional leaders, renewed nuclear negotiations, or expanded back-channel communications could reveal whether both sides are genuinely committed to preventing another military exchange. Reports are coming in that several governments remain actively engaged in facilitating dialogue, even if those efforts rarely make international headlines. If diplomatic momentum continues and military incidents remain limited, this crisis may gradually fade into a broader strategy of managed deterrence. If, however, another major strike, maritime incident, or regional proxy confrontation occurs, the fragile balance we've discussed throughout this analysis could unravel far more quickly than many expect. That's why the next phase matters so much. The confrontation has moved beyond immediate military action. It has become a long-term contest of political judgment, strategic patience, and deterrence. The decisions made over the coming months may shape regional security for years to come. These next few months are critical. Hit the like button if you want follow-up coverage, and make sure you've turned on notifications so you don't miss future analysis as these key developments unfold. That's the story. What began as another military confrontation between the United States and Iran evolved into something much more significant. A demonstration of how modern conflicts are fought not only with missiles and aircraft, but with deterrence, diplomacy, strategic messaging, and calculated restraint. The story wasn't simply about who launched the first strike or who claimed victory afterward. It was about how both governments attempted to project strength while avoiding a wider regional war. We've moved from an era where military superiority alone defined outcomes to one where perception, alliances, economic resilience, and political judgment play equally important roles. That transformation may prove to be one of the defining characteristics of 21st century geopolitics. Future historians may look back on this period not as the beginning of a new war, but as another example of how close major powers can come to escalation before stepping back from the brink. Here's what kept me thinking long after the headlines faded. The most dangerous moments in international politics are often the ones that appear to end quietly. When governments successfully avoid catastrophe, the public quickly moves on, but the underlying disputes remain unresolved. The military capabilities continue to expand, regional alliances continue to evolve, and the next crisis may arrive with even less warning than the last. That uncertainty is what concerns me most. Whether recent events represent a successful example of deterrence or merely a temporary pause depends entirely on what happens next. The coming months, not just the military decisions, but the diplomatic ones, will reveal whether both sides have truly learned from this confrontation or are simply preparing for the next chapter. I'm genuinely curious what you think. Do you believe the recent crisis has strengthened deterrence and reduced the likelihood of another conflict, or has it simply postponed a larger confrontation? And what role should diplomacy play in preventing future escalation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm interested in your perspective on where this is headed.